In 2012, a single nickname, coined almost as an offhand joke in an internal government email, triggered one of the biggest food safety panics in modern American history, ended a decades-long production process at multiple major beef processing plants within weeks, and eventually led to one of the largest media defamation settlements ever recorded. The product at the center of it all is still legal in the United States today. It is called lean, finely textured beef, and almost everyone just knows it by the name that stuck: pink slime. This video is about what that product actually is, how the process that makes it actually works, why it exploded into a national controversy the way it did, and why, more than a decade later, it remains legal under USDA regulation in the US, with no real regulatory pathway into the European beef supply at all. Let's start with what lean, finely textured beef actually is, because the process is more specific and honestly more interesting from a food science standpoint than the nickname suggests. When cattle are processed into cuts of beef, there's a substantial amount of fatty trim left over, the scraps of meat still clinging to fat after the primary cuts have been removed. Historically, a lot of that trim, because separating out the usable lean meat from the fat was labor-intensive and inefficient, ended up going to lower value uses like pet food or rendering, essentially treated as a waste byproduct of the main cutting process. In the 1990s, a company called Beef Products Incorporated developed an industrial process to reclaim the lean meat from that fatty trim more efficiently. The trim is warmed slightly and spun in a centrifuge, a machine that uses rapid rotation to separate materials of different densities, in this case, separating the lean meat protein from the surrounding fat, similar in principle to how a centrifuge separates cream from milk. What comes out the other side is a lean beef product, finely textured because of the mechanical separation process, that is then treated with a puff of ammonia gas, which raises the pH of the product specifically to kill potential bacterial contamination like E. coli and salmonella before it is compressed, frozen, and shipped to be blended into ground beef products. That ammonia treatment step is the specific piece that eventually became the center of the entire controversy. Even though ammonium hydroxide itself is a compound the FDA classifies as generally recognized as safe, and one that is used in a range of other food products entirely unrelated to beef, and it is used as a leavening agent in some baked goods and as a processing aid in producing Dutched or alkalized cocoa powder, among other uses. The compound itself isn't unique to this product or inherently exotic. What made it controversial was specifically its association with reclaimed beef trim once the public actually learned the process existed. For roughly 2 decades, this product was used widely across the US beef industry, blended into ground beef sold in supermarkets and used by fast food chains and school lunch programs, largely without public awareness of the process behind it because USDA regulation classified it as beef and did not require it to be separately declared as a distinct ingredient on packaging. That changed abruptly in March 2012 when ABC News ran an extensive investigative report on the product, drawing heavily on the nickname pink slime, a phrase that had actually originated years earlier in an internal email from a USDA microbiologist who had used it informally to describe the product's appearance during a food safety debate within the agency itself. Once that specific phrase reached a national television audience alongside detailed reporting on the ammonia treatment process and the fact that it was not being separately disclosed on labels, public reaction was fast and severe. The story built on momentum that had actually started a year earlier, in 2011, when British celebrity chef Jamie Oliver ran a segment on his American television series specifically demonstrating and criticizing the production process, which had already begun raising public awareness before the ABC News reporting turned it into a full-blown national story. Within weeks of the ABC News coverage, several major fast food chains, along with a number of large grocery retailers, publicly announced they were dropping the product from their beef supply chains, responding directly to sudden and intense consumer pressure rather than to any new regulatory action. USDA's position on the product's safety and legal status never actually changed throughout the controversy. Beef Products Incorporated, the company that had developed and commercialized the process decades earlier, saw its business collapse almost overnight. closing 3 of its 4 production plants and laying off the majority of its workforce within that same short window. The story didn't end with the immediate 2012 backlash either. Beef Products Incorporated filed a defamation lawsuit against ABC News in 2012, arguing that the network's reporting had used the pink slime framing in a way that was deliberately misleading about the product's safety, causing catastrophic and unjustified financial harm to the company. That lawsuit dragged on for years, seeking damages reported to be in the range of nearly $2 billion under South Dakota's agricultural disparagement law, a type of statute specifically designed to protect food producers from claims that unfairly disparage their products. In 2017, on the eve of trial, ABC News and its parent company settled the case, with reporting at the time indicating the settlement and related costs ran into the hundreds of millions of dollars, making it one of the largest media defamation settlements in U.S. history, even though the exact settlement terms themselves were kept confidential and never fully disclosed publicly. One specific thread of the 2012 controversy deserves its own mention because it added a genuinely different kind of stakes to the story beyond ordinary grocery store beef: school lunches. At the time of the controversy, USDA was purchasing ground beef containing lean, finely textured beef for use in the National School Lunch Program, meaning the product was reaching millions of children through school cafeterias specifically, without parents having any practical way to know or choose otherwise. That detail, once it became widely reported alongside the broader ABC News coverage, significantly amplified public anger beyond what a purely consumer choice grocery store issue might have generated on its own, parents specifically objecting to their children being served a product they'd had no opportunity to learn about or opt out of. USDA responded within weeks by announcing that schools participating in the federal lunch program would be given the choice to specifically request ground beef without lean, finely textured beef going forward. A policy change that arrived directly as a result of the public pressure, not from any change in the agency's underlying safety assessment of the product itself. The legal battle that followed is also worth understanding a little more because South Dakota's agricultural disparagement law, the statute Beef Products Incorporated used to sue ABC News, is itself a genuinely unusual and relatively obscure category of American law. A little over a dozen U.S. states have some version of these statutes, sometimes informally called veggie libel laws, originally passed in the 1990s, largely in response to earlier controversies over food safety reporting on products like alar-treated apples. They create a specific legal path for agricultural producers to sue over public statements about their products that go beyond ordinary defamation standards, generally requiring that a disparaging claim be based on reliable scientific evidence to qualify for protection under free speech grounds. Because Beef Products Incorporated was based in South Dakota, it was able to bring its case under that state's version of the law, and the sheer scale of the eventual settlement is part of why the case is still cited today as a cautionary example for media organizations reporting on agricultural and food safety topics, well beyond the beef industry specifically. So where does this actually leave the product's legal status today, more than a decade later? In the United States, nothing about lean, finely textured beef's underlying legal status changed as a result of any of this. USDA classified the product as beef decades ago based on its own food safety review of the ammonia treatment process, and that classification has never been reversed. It remains legal to produce and sell, and it remains legal to include in ground beef without a separate ingredient declaration distinguishing it from beef trim, processed the conventional way. What did change was market behavior. Following the 2012 collapse in demand, USDA introduced a voluntary labeling framework allowing producers to specifically state that the package contains no lean, finely textured beef for retailers who wanted to make that claim, and a substantial share of major grocery store brands and national retailers have used exactly that labeling in the years since, responding to sustained consumer preference rather than to any legal requirement forcing the change. This is the same voluntary reformulation pattern that has shown up again and again across this entire channel. It's worth understanding the centrifuge process itself in a bit more mechanical detail because it explains why the finished product ends up with the specific texture and appearance that eventually earned it such a memorable, damaging nickname. Beef fat and lean muscle protein have different densities, and when the warm trim is spun at high speed in an industrial centrifuge, that density difference causes the two components to separate outward at different rates, similar in principle to how a salad spinner separates water from lettuce leaves using centrifugal force just at a much larger industrial scale and with far more mechanical force involved. The recovered lean protein that comes out of that separation process has a smooth, semi-liquid, pinkish consistency at that intermediate stage, well before it's frozen into the compressed blocks that actually get shipped to processing plants and blended into ground beef. And it was specifically that intermediate stage appearance, rather than the finished frozen product most consumers would ever have actually seen, that the original internal government email description and later the viral nickname built on it was describing. In the European Union, this specific product essentially doesn't have a legal pathway to market in the first place, which makes this a genuinely different kind of story than most of what we've covered so far. It's not that regulators specifically evaluated this exact product and banned it by name, the way we've seen with bromate or titanium dioxide. It's that EU meat hygiene regulation governs which decontamination treatments are authorized for use on meat intended for human consumption, and ammonia gas treatment of centrifugally separated beef trim isn't among the processes authorized under that framework. Without an approved pathway for that specific production method, the product simply has no route into the EU beef supply as currently regulated, regardless of whether EU food safety authorities have ever conducted a dedicated named review of lean, finely textured beef the way EFSA did for titanium dioxide or neonicotinoids. It's a structural exclusion built into how EU meat processing is regulated more broadly, rather than a targeted prohibition of one specific named product. It's worth being fair to the industry side of this story too, because the underlying motivation behind developing this process in the first place was not purely about cutting costs at consumers' expense, because it genuinely did address a real efficiency and food waste problem. Reclaiming usable lean protein from trim that would otherwise be discarded or diverted to lower value uses is, from a pure resource utilization standpoint, a more efficient use of the animal, and industry representatives have consistently made that sustainability argument in the product's defense throughout the controversy and in the years since. The core public objection was less about that underlying efficiency logic and more about the combination of two separate things: the ammonia treatment process itself, once people learned about it, and the fact that its use was not specifically disclosed on packaging, which is really a transparency and consumer choice question as much as it is a food safety one, since USDA's own safety review of the process was never seriously challenged or reversed by the controversy. So practically, here's what you can actually check the next time you're buying ground beef. Look specifically for the words "contains no lean, finely textured beef" on the package, which a meaningful share of major U.S. grocery chains and beef brands have voluntarily adopted since 2012, or for retailer-specific claims like 100% ground beef or W whole muscle cuts only, language some brands use to signal the same thing without using the LFTB terminology directly. If a package does not make either kind of claim, the product's LFTB status generally is not disclosed one way or the other. Since federal law still does not require it, the presence or absence of a voluntary claim on the label is really the only reliable signal available to a shopper standing in front of the meat case. This channel compares food and product standards across the US, UK, and EU using publicly available regulatory information, including USD, meat processing and labeling regulations, EU meat hygiene regulation, and public court records from Beef Products Incorporated's litigation against ABC News. Content is for informational and entertainment purposes only and is not legal advice. Regulations and labeling practices change over time, so always check current labels and official sources for yourself. We are not affiliated with or endorsed by ABC News, Beef Products Incorporated, or any other brand, company, or organization mentioned. Next time, we are heading somewhere that might surprise you even more: the sandwich aisle, and why American cheese is not even legally allowed to be called cheese under European food law. Subscribe if you want to see exactly where that line gets drawn.